It was the morning of Christmas Eve, 2002. An 8.5-month pregnant woman vanished from her own home, leaving behind a meticulously decorated nursery, a purse hanging in the hall closet, and a golden retriever wandering the neighborhood with its muddy leash still attached. The true paradox wasn't just the sudden disappearance hours before a major holiday, it was the husband. He stood in the center of the frantic search, a man whose pulse never seemed to quicken, whose demeanor remained chillingly flat, even as the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay silently guarded a horrific truth. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Modesto, California, sits in the agricultural heartland of the Central Valley, a sprawling expanse of almond orchards and dairy farms where generations of families set down deep roots. Lassie Denise Rocha was an absolute product of this environment. Born in the spring of 1975, she possessed a kinetic energy that easily filled whatever room she entered. She stood just 5 feet and 1 inch tall, yet her presence was unmistakable, marked by a booming, infectious laugh and an intense loyalty to her inner circle. Friends recalled a woman who was fiercely domestic, someone who reveled in the tactile pleasures of cooking, gardening, and hosting elaborate dinner parties. She did not merely want a house, she wanted to build an entire ecosystem of warmth. She pursued a degree in ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University, drawn to the simple, grounding idea of cultivating life from the soil up. Scott Peterson occupied a very different emotional frequency. Raised hundreds of miles south in San Diego, within a household defined by country club memberships and high expectations, he was the undisputed golden boy of his family. He was athletic, standing well over 6 feet, with the kind of polished, symmetrical features that immediately commanded trust on a manicured fairway. For a time, he fiercely chased a career as a professional golfer, an ambition that eventually evaporated, giving way to the more pragmatic reality of agricultural sales. Working as a regional representative for a global fertilizer company, Scott built a reputation as a consummate professional. He spent his days driving thousands of miles across the state, living out of his truck and navigating the high-pressure demands of quotas and client relations. He was unfailingly polite, intensely private, and notoriously conflict avoidant. Acquaintances noted his emotional baseline never seemed to fluctuate, a trait that initially appeared as stoic reliability, but would soon be scrutinized as something profoundly disconnected. To the outside observer, the couple represented the apex of early 2000s suburban achievement. After marrying and relocating to Modesto to be closer to Lassie's extensive family network, they purchased a charming green stucco bungalow on Covenant Avenue. The property quickly became Lacey's canvas. She spent her weekends repainting walls, tending to the backyard pool, and preparing for the ultimate realization of her domestic dream. She was carrying a boy whom they had already agreed to name Connor. The nursery was meticulously assembled, decorated in a nautical theme with crisp blue and white accents, awaiting a birth scheduled for early February. While the expectant mother surrendered herself entirely to the nesting process, a silent friction was taking hold beneath the polished veneer of their marriage. Scott was a man accustomed to the untethered freedom of the open road. His career provided a perfect cover for long hours of isolation, allowing him to maintain a bachelor-like autonomy even within the confines of matrimony. The impending reality of a newborn meant a permanent anchor. It signaled an end to spontaneous golf outings and the beginning of severe financial strain, sleepless nights, and unrelenting parental responsibility. Yet, true to his tightly controlled nature, Scott never voiced these mounting anxieties. He maintained the facade flawlessly. He smiled during the ultrasound appointments, helped assemble the baby furniture, and played the role of the devoted father-to-be with a practiced, hollow ease. The neighbors looking out their windows saw a handsome salesman and his radiant, heavily pregnant wife walking their golden retriever through the quiet streets, completely unaware of the psychological chasm rapidly widening inside the green bungalow. They first crossed paths in the mid-90s at a small, bustling cafe near the California Polytechnic State University campus. She was visiting a friend. He was waiting tables, earning his way through school. Characteristically bold, she made the first move, leaving her phone number on a scrap of paper for the handsome waiter. He called her almost immediately. Within months, the courtship accelerated into a serious, consuming partnership. They shared a drive to build something tangible, pooling their resources to open a sports bar and restaurant in the coastal town of San Luis Obispo. It was a grueling endeavor. They spent their days flipping burgers, managing inventory, and dealing with raucous college crowds. An exhausting routine that forged a deep operational partnership. The business was surprisingly successful, yet the brutal hours and the lingering smell of fryers meant they had little energy for the upscale leisure they both deeply coveted. Seeking a more traditional life, they sold the restaurant and migrated north to the agricultural heart of the Central Valley. Modesto was her territory, a town where her family wielded significant social influence and gathered for massive, obligatory Sunday dinners. For the ambitious husband, this relocation was both a blessing and a psychological trap. He secured a lucrative position with an international agricultural firm, tasked with selling specialized fertilizers and irrigation systems to massive farming conglomerates. The job came with a generous expense account, a company truck, and the prestige of a corporate title. Flush with the promise of this new income, they purchased the 3-bedroom bungalow in an affluent neighborhood and immediately joined the local country club. Here, the projection of perfection became a full-time occupation. She transformed into the quintessential suburban hostess. She threw lavish dinner parties, meticulously decorated the porch for every minor holiday, and maintained an immaculate home. He spent his weekends on pristine golf courses, rubbing elbows with wealthy doctors and lawyers, desperate to prove he belonged in their tax bracket. The image they cultivated was flawless, a beautiful young couple on a steep upward trajectory. But the math behind the mahogany furniture and the country club dues told a radically different, rotting story. The fertilizer business was subject to the vicious, unpredictable cycles of California agriculture. His base salary was modest. The real money relied heavily on commissions that fluctuated wildly with the weather and commodity prices. To bridge the gap between their income and their aggressive spending habits, they leaned heavily on her family. Her mother frequently paid for their extravagant vacations, while a modest inheritance was quietly drained to cover mortgage gaps. For a man obsessed with his own autonomy and public image, this financial dependence was corrosive. He was the supposed breadwinner, yet his lifestyle was subsidized by his in-laws. He began hiding the depth of their debt. Credit cards were quietly maxed out. Monthly expenses consistently eclipsed his paychecks. The pressure to maintain the facade of the wealthy, successful businessman created a pressurized container of resentment. He never yelled. He never complained about the mounting bills. Instead, he internalized the stress, retreating further into his work trips. The sprawling, dusty highways of the San Joaquin Valley became his sanctuary. Out there, driving hundreds of miles a week, he wasn't the struggling husband relying on his wife's family. He was a sharp, successful operator accountable to absolutely no one. The breaking point disguised itself as a miracle. For years, she had openly yearned for motherhood, experiencing the quiet heartbreak of fertility struggles. When the positive test finally arrived in the spring of 2002, her joy was absolute and consuming. She immediately shifted her formidable energy toward preparing for the baby. The bungalow underwent a massive physical transformation. Spare rooms were aggressively cleared out, expensive baby registries were curated, and her entire social calendar became dominated by discussions of trimesters and pediatricians. Her husband's reaction was a masterclass in emotional mimicry. He attended the doctor's appointments, nodded thoughtfully during discussions about crib mattresses, and accepted congratulations from his golf buddies with a practiced smile. But beneath the stoic exterior, a profound panic was taking root. The impending birth represented the final, inescapable lock on his cage. A child meant his remaining disposable income would vanish. It meant the end of impromptu weekend trips and the death of the bachelor-like freedom he experienced on the road. As her abdomen grew, her physical mobility decreased. The oppressive summer heat of the Central Valley, often soaring well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, forced her to spend more time indoors. She relied on him heavier than ever before. She needed him to lift groceries, to assemble heavy furniture, to simply be present. Every request, no matter how mundane, felt to him like a tightening leash. He began to stay out later. He manufactured reasons to extend his business trips, choosing the isolation of sterile hotel rooms over the suffocating domesticity of the Covenant Avenue home. The green bungalow was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was a shrine to an impending responsibility he secretly despised. Yet the psychological fracture was complete. He was a man staring down the barrel of a lifetime of fatherhood and financial obligation, quietly deciding that he would rather orchestrate total annihilation than face the humiliation of a messy, expensive divorce. The morning of December 24th, 2002, broke cold and damp across the Central Valley. The temperature hovered in the low 40s, wrapping the residential streets in a thin, biting chill. Inside the green stucco house on Covenant Avenue, the early hours played out with a deceptive, mundane rhythm. The expectant mother was up early, dressed in a crisp white maternity blouse and dark pants, moving with the heavy, measured steps of a woman just weeks away from delivery. She was preparing for a day steeped in domestic tradition, baking gingerbread cookies, prepping a massive holiday dinner, and wrapping the final gifts beneath a brilliantly lit pine tree. The television hummed in the background, broadcasting a popular morning lifestyle show about holiday meringues. Her husband was also preparing to leave, though his itinerary was undergoing a sudden, highly calculated shift. For weeks, he had maintained a steadfast narrative with his family and colleagues, claiming he would spend Christmas Eve morning on the local golf course. But as the morning progressed, he casually informed his wife that it was simply too cold for 18 holes. He was going fishing instead. The logic was profoundly fractured. He was trading the inland chill of a manicured fairway for the notoriously freezing, wind-whipped expanse of the San Francisco Bay, a massive body of water located 90 miles to the west. Before leaving the city limits, he navigated his Ford pickup toward a commercial storage facility. This dusty industrial unit served as the headquarters for his fertilizer business, but its true purpose was far more sinister. Tucked away among pallets of agricultural chemicals sat a 14-foot aluminum game fisher. He had purchased the vessel weeks earlier through a classified ad, handing over a thick stack of cash and registering the craft under a falsified address. He had kept this purchase an absolute secret, hiding it from his wife, his parents, and his closest friends. Inside the warehouse, the heavy scent of damp concrete hung in the cold air. He had recently used an 80-pound bag of cement and small plastic pitchers to cast heavy, homemade anchors. 5 were manufactured in the shadows of the storage unit. Only 1 would ever be found inside the boat. He hitched the aluminum craft to his truck, pulling out onto the highway as the valley fog began to burn off. Back in the quiet, affluent neighborhood, the timeline of normalcy was rapidly collapsing. At approximately 10:18 a.m., a neighbor glanced out her front window and noticed a flash of golden fur moving down the pavement. It was the couple's retriever, wandering aimlessly down the center of the street. The dog was completely alone, a muddy nylon leash trailing behind it on the cold asphalt. The neighbor stepped outside, grabbed the wet strap, and guided the animal back to the property. She opened the side gate, secured the dog in the backyard, and turned away, sensing no immediate alarm. The property was locked tight. There were no shattered windows, no overturned furniture, no echoes of a struggle. The house was a sealed vault of absolute silence. While the dog paced the enclosed yard, the Ford pickup was merging onto Interstate 580, towing the secret boat toward the jagged coastline. The geography shifted drastically, the flat agricultural plains giving way to the damp, salty air of the Pacific coast. He arrived at the Berkeley Marina, pulling a time-stamped parking ticket from the automated kiosk at precisely 12:54 p.m. The sky overhead was a bruising, overcast gray, matching the churning, freezing waters of the bay. He backed the trailer down the steep concrete ramp, launching the narrow aluminum shell into the chop. The physical mechanics required for the next hour were staggering. The game fisher was exceptionally lightweight and notoriously unstable in tidal currents. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, forced to maneuver within a confined, rocking space while managing the dead weight of a heavily pregnant adult and over 100 pounds of concrete. The logistics demanded terrifying balance and extreme physical exertion over the deep, unforgiving waters near Brooks Island. He later claimed he was angling for sturgeon, yet his tackle box contained the wrong lures, and his lightweight rod was entirely incapable of handling the massive, bottom-feeding fish native to those waters. By mid-afternoon, the boat was pulled from the freezing saltwater and strapped back onto the trailer. The drive back to the valley was methodical, punctuated by the deliberate creation of a digital and auditory alibi. He stopped for gas, carefully retaining the printed receipt. He used his cellular phone to leave a bright, casually affectionate voicemail for his wife, stating he was on his way home and that he loved her. He returned to the commercial warehouse, backing the boat into the shadows, leaving behind his fishing gear and the lingering dust of the cement mix. At 4:30 p.m., the Ford pickup pulled into the driveway on Covina Avenue. The winter sun was already dipping below the horizon, plunging the front yard into deep shadow. He unlocked the back door and stepped inside. The house was entirely dark. The television was off. A bucket of soapy water and a mop sat abandoned on the kitchen floor. The cleaning task abruptly halted mid-stroke. The baking ingredients remained untouched on the counter. In the entryway closet, his wife's purse hung undisturbed, containing her keys, her wallet, and her sunglasses. Her vehicle was parked securely in the driveway. The golden retriever barked from the backyard, the muddy leash still clipped to its collar. Human instinct dictates that a man encountering this specific set of circumstances, a missing pregnant wife, abandoned belongings, an interrupted chore, would experience an immediate, violent spike of adrenaline. A normal reaction involves sprinting to the neighbors, frantically searching the streets, and dialing emergency services. His reaction was an absolute void. He walked into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of cold milk, and pulled out a slice of leftover pizza. He stood in the quiet, empty house and ate. When he finished, he walked to the laundry room, stripped off his clothing, and placed the garments into the washing machine. He stepped into the bathroom and took a long, hot shower, washing away the salt spray of the bay. He dried off and dressed in clean, casual clothes. Only after completing this sterile, mechanical routine did he finally reach for a telephone. It was 5:15 p.m. He did not dial emergency services. He did not call the local hospitals. He called his mother-in-law. When the older woman answered the line, he did not ask if her daughter had stopped by for a holiday visit. He did not ask if they had spoken earlier in the afternoon. Instead, his phrasing was chillingly definitive. He stated in a flat, monotone voice, devoid of panic, devoid of breathlessness, that she was missing. When the missing woman's mother received the phone call, the foundation of her reality instantly fractured. The panic was immediate and primal. Extended family members abandoned half-cooked holiday meals, leaving ovens burning as they raced across town to the green bungalow. Modesto police were dispatched just before 6 p.m. Law enforcement typically approaches missing adult cases with a degree of measured patience, operating under the statistical probability of a voluntary departure or a simple miscommunication. But an 8.5-month pregnant woman walking out into a bitter 40-degree night without her purse, her winter coat, or her vehicle instantly shattered standard protocol. By nightfall, the quiet suburban street was pulsing with the red and blue strobes of squad cars. Desperate relatives and terrified neighbors plunged into the brush of nearby East La Loma Park, sweeping the muddy trails and deep ravines with heavy flashlights. They screamed her name into the freezing dark, their voices swallowed by the dense winter fog rolling off the Tuolumne River. Amidst this frantic, tearful mobilization, the husband stood out as a striking, deeply disturbing anomaly. While his in-laws wept openly and hyperventilated on the sidewalk, he remained anchored in a state of clinical detachment. When uniform officers separated him from the chaos to establish a baseline of events, he answered their questions with terrifying calmness. He offered up his alibi without prompting: the spontaneous fishing trip, the 90-mile commute to the Berkeley Marina, the cold hours spent on the bay. Detectives immediately cataloged his physical state. They noticed fresh, raw scrapes across his knuckles. He swiftly attributed the injuries to reaching into his truck's metal toolbox. The explanation was dutifully recorded in their notepads, but the investigators' internal alarms were already blaring. Men whose pregnant wives have vanished do not casually parse out their alibis with the polished ease of a corporate sales pitch. Christmas morning broke over a city that had fundamentally altered its identity overnight. The holiday effectively ceased to exist within the Modesto city limits. Instead of gathering around decorated trees, hundreds of local residents mobilized, descending upon a sprawling makeshift command center set up in the ballroom of a nearby hotel. The social echo was deafening. The community rallied with ferocious intensity, fueled by a collective, suffocating dread. Thousands of glossy flyers bearing the smiling face of the expectant mother were printed. Volunteers plastered them onto every telephone pole, chain link fence, and storefront window within a 50-mile radius. The atmosphere in the town shifted from festive to paranoid. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion, double-locking their doors, gripped by the terrifying theory that a random, violent predator was actively hunting in their manicured neighborhoods. By December 26, local concern had mutated into a massive national spectacle. Satellite trucks choked the narrow residential avenues, their heavy cables snaking across suburban lawns. The image of the glowing brunette woman became a permanent fixture on every cable news network across the country. The media machine possessed a voracious appetite, hungering for the grieving husband to step before the microphones, shed tears, and beg the public for his family's safe return. But he consistently retreated from the harsh glare of the camera lights. He dodged on-camera interviews, opting instead to hand out flyers on the distant periphery of the search grids. When he was occasionally caught in the background of a broadcast, his micro-expressions were glaringly inappropriate. A polite smile here, a casual chuckle with a passing acquaintance there. It was the relaxed body language of a man waiting for a table at a restaurant, entirely disjointed from the horrific reality of a missing wife and unborn child. Inside the fortified walls of the Modesto Police Department, the lens of the investigation was narrowing exclusively onto him. Detectives executed a search warrant on the Covina Avenue property, treating the quiet home as a potential crime scene. They noted the overwhelming chemical scent of bleach. They scrutinized the mop bucket left abandoned on the kitchen floor. They began to aggressively dismantle his timeline, the narrative of driving 90 miles to the freezing saltwater on a damp winter morning to fish for massive sturgeon in a 14-foot, wildly unstable aluminum boat defied all basic logic. Hoping to force a tactical error, investigators formally asked him to submit to a polygraph examination. They presented it as a standard procedure to eliminate him as a suspect and focus their resources on other leads. He flatly refused. He cited his extreme emotional distress as the reason, claiming it would skew the biometric results. A justification that directly contradicted the absolute chilling void of emotion he displayed to everyone around him. When police inevitably extended their search grid to the Berkeley Marina, tracing the exact route he claimed to have taken, they found the waters cold, murky, and relentlessly deep. Sonar equipment and dive teams were deployed into the freezing currents, scanning the muddy bottom of the bay. He watched the massive recovery operation unfold with an eerie passivity. When detectives asked him to detail his exact movements on the water that day, his answers became frustratingly vague. He could not pinpoint his fishing locations. He showed more concern for the physical condition of his impounded Ford pickup than the sprawling, multi-agency manhunt. The victim's family was trapped in an agonizing psychological purgatory. For the first few weeks, they stood as an impenetrable shield around him. They fiercely defended his character in press conferences, desperate to preserve the image of the perfect marriage. Acknowledging that the calm, handsome man standing in their living room might be responsible for the annihilation of their daughter meant accepting a level of evil too massive for the human brain to process. But as the days bled into weeks, the fragile facade began to crack. The tipping point for her loved ones wasn't a single dramatic revelation, but a slow, agonizing accumulation of red flags. They noticed his stark reluctance to look them in the eye. They caught him making casual, hushed phone calls while they wept over topographical search maps. He stopped asking the police for updates on the investigation. He began quietly inquiring about selling the Covina Avenue house, a move that signaled a terrifying finality. While hundreds of strangers were still actively combing the local parks and riverbanks, holding out desperate hope for a safe return, he was secretly canceling his wife's premium cable television subscription. A terrifying realization began to creep into their exhausted minds. The man they had welcomed into their family was not behaving like a frantic survivor clinging to hope. He was acting like a liability manager, carefully monitoring a crisis he had orchestrated. The Modesto Police Department was initially drowning in a paralyzing volume of noise. Thousands of frantic calls flooded the dedicated tip lines, generating an endless, chaotic labyrinth of false leads. A documented burglary had occurred directly across the street from the Covenant Avenue property, at precisely the time the expectant mother was believed to have vanished. 2 local men had broken into a residence, loading a heavy metal safe into a dark van. Detectives frantically chased this angle, burning precious daylight interrogating the known thieves. The suspects were aggressively questioned, timelines were cross-referenced, and polygraphs were administered. The results were deeply frustrating for investigators. The men were absolutely guilty of theft, but entirely unconnected to the missing pregnant woman. They had seen nothing. Simultaneously, the search grid was plagued by dozens of well-meaning but ultimately useless civilian sightings. Panicked residents reported seeing a petite brunette walking a golden retriever through the damp, leaf-strewn trails of East La Loma Park. Law enforcement pulled surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and interviewed park transients. Each sighting systematically evaporated upon closer inspection, chalked up to mistaken identity fueled by community hysteria and the sheer, overwhelming presence of the missing woman's face on every television screen. The noise was deafening, acting as a thick fog that strategically obscured the agonizing lack of physical evidence inside the green bungalow. The structural collapse of the husband's narrative did not originate from a forensic breakthrough or a muddy boot print. It arrived via a phone call on December 30th, merely 6 days into the sprawling manhunt. A 27-year-old massage therapist residing in Fresno contacted the police hotline, carrying a piece of information that would instantly detonate the foundation of the entire investigation. Her name was Amber Frey. She explained to bewildered detectives that she had been engaged in a passionate romantic relationship with the fertilizer salesman since late November. They had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance. During their courtship, he had presented himself as a wealthy, unattached global businessman. The psychological implications of her statement were chilling. She detailed a specific dinner date occurring weeks before the disappearance. He had looked across a dimly lit table, his voice adopting a somber, practiced register, and confessed that he had recently lost his wife. He had explicitly stated that this impending holiday season would be his first one completely alone. Detectives immediately grasped the terrifying magnitude of this lie. The man standing at the edge of the Modesto search grids, calmly accepting the tearful sympathies of a terrified community, had proactively annihilated his spouse in his own mind long before she physically ceased to exist. Recognizing the explosive value of this witness, authorities asked the massage therapist to maintain her connection with the suspect. They covertly wired her cellular phones, transforming her into an active intelligence asset. What followed was an extensive surveillance operation that captured hundreds of hours of recorded audio. The tapes offered a horrifying, unfiltered glimpse into a highly organized sociopathic compartmentalization. While his in-laws hyperventilated on national television and volunteers trudged through freezing mud, he was whispering sweet, future-oriented promises into a phone receiver. He orchestrated a surreal, transatlantic illusion to maintain his facade with the mistress. During a recorded conversation on New Year's Eve, he claimed to be standing in the freezing shadow of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, celebrating the holidays abroad. He described the glittering European lights and even mimicked the ambient noise of a crowd watching fireworks. In reality, he was standing just yards away from a somber, candlelit vigil dedicated to his missing, heavily pregnant wife. His ability to toggle between the grieving husband and the romantic jet-setter without a single tremor in his vocal inflection deeply unnerved veteran investigators. This classified deception could not be contained indefinitely. By late January, tabloids were aggressively circling the rumors of an affair, threatening to leak the mistress's identity and destroy the wiretap operation. To control the narrative and apply maximum psychological pressure on their prime suspect, Modesto police coordinated a highly calculated press conference. The young massage therapist stepped before a blinding wall of camera flashes, publicly exposing the elaborate double life of the supposed grieving husband. The social echo was immediate and cataclysmic. The tight-knit community of Modesto, which had invested thousands of hours and boundless emotional energy searching for a beloved hometown girl, recoiled in absolute disgust. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees on Cavanna Avenue suddenly felt like a mockery. For the victim's family, the press conference was a lethal psychological blow that permanently severed their reality. The agonizing accumulation of red flags, the lack of eye contact, the canceled cable subscriptions, the bizarre fishing trip, instantly solidified into an unbearable truth. The man they had fiercely defended against media scrutiny, the man they had trusted to protect their daughter, had been sleeping with another woman while their grandchild grew in his wife's womb. The family formally withdrew their support, issuing public statements demanding he surrender to the authorities. With the alibi obliterated and a clear motive of personal freedom fully exposed, the entire nature of the investigation pivoted. It was no longer a rescue mission. The Volunteer Command Center in the hotel ballroom was quietly dismantled. Law enforcement officially reclassified the massive file from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation, a daring legal maneuver given they still lacked a crime scene, a murder weapon, and a body. The geographic focus permanently shifted 90 miles west. Advanced side-scan sonar equipment and specialized dive teams from across the state converged on the Berkeley Marina. They mapped the murky, debris-filled bottom of the San Francisco Bay, fighting brutal tidal currents, freezing temperatures, and zero visibility conditions. The detectives knew exactly what they were looking for beneath the dark, choppy surface. They were hunting for the 80-pound concrete anchors the fertilizer salesman had secretly manufactured in the shadows of a dusty commercial warehouse. Mid-April brought a fierce, churning spring storm to the California coast, violently agitating the shallow waters of the San Francisco Bay. The aggressive currents finally dislodged the heavy, submerged secret. A local resident walking along the rocky shoreline of Point Isabel in Richmond spotted something tangled in the marsh grass. It was the remains of a late-term male fetus. The next afternoon, scarcely a mile away, a second horrific discovery washed against the riprap. A heavily decomposed female torso, missing limbs, and clad in tattered maternity wear. The geography was damning. The bodies had surfaced just 2 miles north of the Berkeley Marina, exactly where the aluminum game fisher had been launched months prior. While forensics required complex genetic testing to officially confirm the identities, investigators knew the agonizing physical search had ended. The moment the remains were located, a covert strike team mobilized 300 miles south. Law enforcement had been tracking the prime suspect's vehicle relentlessly, terrified he would slip across the porous international border into Mexico. They intercepted him in the parking lot of a San Diego golf course. The man pulled from the driver's seat bore little resemblance to the polished salesman seen on television. His dark hair was aggressively bleached to a jarring, brassy blonde. Inside the vehicle, detectives cataloged a desperate inventory, nearly $15,000 in bundled cash. His brother's driver's license, water purifiers, camping gear, a dagger, and multiple prepaid cellular phones. He casually told the arresting officers he was simply preparing for a quiet round of golf. The arsenal of survival supplies told a radically different story of an imminent, permanent flight. The resulting trial mutated into an unprecedented media circus, forcing a venue change to San Mateo County just to seat an impartial jury. The prosecution constructed an entirely circumstantial case. They lacked a definitive murder weapon, a primary crime scene, and direct eyewitnesses. Instead, they weaponized his own psychology. The staggering accumulation of lies, the hidden boat, the timeline impossibilities, and the chilling audio tapes. The defense fought a scorched earth campaign, repeatedly pointing to the neighborhood burglars and emphasizing the total absence of forensic transfer inside the Cavanna Avenue home. But the jury rejected the concept of infinite coincidences. They convicted him of first-degree murder for his wife and second-degree murder for his unborn son, handing down a sentence of death. Legal finality proved elusive. Exhaustive appellate warfare eventually overturned the lethal injection mandate due to procedural errors during jury selection, reducing his punishment to life behind bars without parole. Yet the machinery of the justice system refuses to rest. By 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project formally intervened, filing motions to conduct advanced DNA testing on a burned-out van connected to the neighborhood burglary. an aggressive attempt to rewrite history and shatter the circumstantial wall that has kept him in a maximum security cell for 2 decades. The green stucco house on Covena Avenue was eventually sold, its bright nursery dismantled and boxed away forever. Yet the psychological scar left on Modesto remains permanent, a community permanently haunted by the absolute fragility of the American suburban illusion. She believed she was building a warm sanctuary for her unborn son, entirely unaware she was sharing it with an emotional void. When faced with the mundane realities of fatherhood and mounting debt, he did not choose the difficult, honest path of divorce. He chose total, calculated annihilation. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.